Gravity Rush was a clumsy mess. Its story was an overly vague series of bumbling from one location to the next, while being introduced to a series of one-note characters. The combat was a slapdash attempt to capitalise on the exhilarating movement system, but failed due to a lack of polish and variety in mission design. And yet, Gravity Rush was still such a unique concept for an action platformer that its hooks were deep in me by the time I finished the remaster from last year. Now on a new platform, Gravity Rush 2 soars onto the PS4. How is it stacked up against the original Vita game? Let's take a look. The story takes an undisclosed jump ahead in time, where we find our hero Kat working for pennies on a mining airship in the middle of seemingly nowhere. Her jump from the Gravity Queen of Hexaville to a struggling shiprat is bridged with an animated short you can find online. Why the short couldn't have been included as an intro to the game is anyone's guess, but excluding it leaves a rather large gap in the opening hours if you're hoping for a decent explanation of Kat's new location. Despite that, Gravity Rush 2's writing is strong enough to ease you into the new world and characters. The new faces are given enough time to develop alongside returning ones in ways that really just outshine the previous game. Kat's origins are still in question, but now is just one of the many dangling threads of narrative worth seeing through. The huge cast of characters have their own problems, worries and relationships that weave between one another in such a fleshed out way that shows a real shift in the quality of the writing. This isn't to say Gravity Rush 2 is a deep and engaging narrative that delves deep into its thematic uses of class conflict, morality, sacrifice and family, but rather use each light and loosely enough to tie together into a great adventure. There is one quick note I wanted to make, and though I'm keeping it entirely spoiler free, if you're someone trying to avoid everything to do with Gravity Rush, just avoid the next few minutes. Okay, so Gravity Rush 2 is divided into multiple chapters with story missions following the same episodic format as the first game. By the end of my 35-hour run, the story had wrapped itself up rather nicely. There's enough of a hook for the next game, similarly to Gravity Rush 1, but then something happens. An optional epilogue opened up. One that's primed with a warning saying, hey, this might take a while, are you sure you want to proceed? Kinda confused at the time, I hit yes and played through what I can only describe as one of the weirdest epilogues I've ever played through. To sum it up in a very spoiler-free way, it quite literally plays out what I've interpreted as a condensed Gravity Rush 3. It almost feels like Team Siren and Sony Interactive Japan built this optional yet final chapter as an out in the event a third game just isn't on the table. It's a bizarre but still oddly touching series of events that wraps up Kat's world, even if it's not the most fun to play through. Why that's the case is what we'll move on to next. One of the previous game's biggest issues was its mission design. Almost every situation devolved into a combat scenario where you relied on this awful lock-on and melee system against enemies that required a level of preciseness the tools at your disposal just couldn't handle. It was a drag going through the same song and dance of clunky combat with no variation outside of the optional challenge missions and time trials. Gravity Rush 2 has largely addressed these shortcomings by providing an enormous amount of variety in both optional and story missions, although sometimes not for the better. Gravity shifting is no longer a means to just combat and puzzle solving, but directly ties into what you'll do as Kat in every mission in a smarter way than before. Finding vantage points to photograph shady arms deals, sneaking onto floating military bases, or defending an airship against enemy borders are just examples where the story guides you in these different directions, and from a gameplay perspective, it does a good job of keeping things fresh. But there are a handful of times where this sense of freshness with all these new mechanics kind of actually sours itself by a severe lack of polish on some of the missions, especially stealth ones. It's hard to tell you who can see you from what direction with a lack of indicators outside of a detection meter, which is doubled when being spotted just resets you back to where you started. This sort of tedium is in no short supply, as a handful of other mission types have you performing adventure game level tasks like clicking on items in the right order. What starts as a welcome change of pace from combat scenarios devolves into an utter chore when you're 30 hours in and coming from an over the top boss fight to just showing people in the street a photograph hoping the game goes, hey, the player's clicked on enough people, let's continue with the mission. There's a fine line between novel and dull when it comes to this sort of wide range in mission types. It's just a shame to see Gravity Rush 2 stumble more than a handful of times with these sort of issues. One of the worst hurdles to overcome in the original Gravity Rush is the combat. You had your melee combos, the gravity kick, the stasis field, and an ultimate move to destroy a large amount of foes. The Nevi were the main enemy you faced with points of vulnerability you had to strike in order to defeat them. It seems like a fairly simple challenge, but the difficulty wasn't in how agile or deadly the Nevi were. It was in the awful aforementioned lack of polish on Cat's abilities that would sour any fun had with the way you moved around the environment. This time the lock-on is stronger, the melee attacks have been tightened up, and the introduction of gravity styles allow you to deal with enemies in a lot more satisfying ways. Things like airborne combat, which was one of the major nuisances of the original Gravity Rush, becomes significantly more tolerable with one particular ability set. But while the new abilities and tightness almost completely fixed the issues had with the first game's combat, the boss fights add a whole new level of excitement and frustration. Many boss battles pit you against enemies as agile as Cat herself, and those are intensely fun. They force you to use everything at your disposal, with mid-air dodging, throwing objects, and waiting for vulnerable moments to strike, and those capitalise on the best parts of Gravity Rush's movement and the new combat mechanics. However, it's when the static or slower bosses are thrown at you does Gravity Rush 2 stumble right back into its old ways. Many of the issues with the lock-on system return and end up actually punishing you for what feels like isn't your fault. The slower bosses bring back the frustration in such a strong way that's only compounded by the game's awful camera system. The camera simply can't keep up or adjust to the rapid motion of the game's movement, leading to a lot of times where I had no idea which direction I was headed in, or where a gravity kick would have left me, as the camera would be stuck either inside a large boss, or in some cases the environment. At the end of the day, Gravity Rush 2 is a significant improvement over its predecessor. The story is leagues stronger than the vague nonsense of the original game, and the same praise can be applied to certain parts of its mission design and combat. The great variety in activities is a double-edged sword at times, with a lack of tightness on the stream of new concepts leading to a lot of frustration. But for what it lacks in polish, Gravity Rush 2 makes up for it in its refinement of the combat, the boss battles, phenomenal art style, and a universe really just worth seeing through. I give Gravity Rush 2 a 4 out of 5. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. God, this took a little longer than expected, but hey, it came out quicker and better than Dishonored 2's review, so that's a big plus in my book. Other stuff coming out on the channel this week. Hopefully there'll be another video hopping out. You can check out Luke's Resident Evil 7 review. That's pretty good. I haven't checked it out myself, as I've been trying to avoid anything about Resident Evil, but outside of that, look forward to some stuff about For Honor coming out this week. The open beta starts, I think it was yesterday. So that's gonna do it. Keep an eye on this space, and we'll see you later, cowpokes. I don't know what kind of voice I'm doing.